They taught us in school that in 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered America. But what if we told you he was nearly 500 years late? Before Columbus ever set sail, other explorers had already reached these shores. From Vikings to Chinese admirals, and even forgotten African empires, the truth has been buried beneath centuries of colonial myth. This is the story they don't want you to know. Welcome to History Vault. And this is the real discovery of America. For centuries, the world has believed in one single narrative, that in 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered America. This line, echoed in school books, national holidays, and cultural memory, has shaped how generations have viewed history. But this so-called discovery is not just misleading. It's a distortion of reality that has overshadowed entire civilizations, buried ancient legacies, and rewritten the truth in favor of colonial conquest. The land Columbus reached was not empty. It wasn't waiting for a European to plant a flag or declare it claimed. It was already home to millions of people, diverse in culture, language, technology, and governance. From the Arctic to the Andes, the Americas were alive with thriving societies. And yet, with the stroke of a pen and the raising of a sail, history was rewritten as though nothing had existed before 1492. The people who lived in the Americas had built cities, managed agriculture, developed religions, traded across vast distances, and created knowledge systems completely independent of Europe or Asia. The word discovery implies a blank slate, an untouched world. But the reality was far from it. These were civilizations with long and deep histories, some older than many kingdoms of Europe itself. In Central America, the Maya had developed advanced mathematics, a written language, and an intricate calendar that stunned European observers when they finally saw its precision. They built towering pyramids without metal tools or the wheel, and constructed cities that rivaled those of ancient Greece and Rome. Further north, in what is now modern-day Mexico, the Aztecs constructed the stunning city of Tenochtitlan, complete with canals, floating gardens, wide boulevards, and temples to the heavens. Spanish conquistadors arriving there marveled at its sophistication. One of them, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, even remarked that it was more magnificent than anything he had seen in Europe. In South America, the Inca Empire stretched across the spine of the Andes, uniting millions through a network of roads longer than the Roman empires. They had no written script, but used a complex system of knotted cords called quipus to record information, an intellectual feat still being studied today. Their understanding of astronomy, architecture, and agriculture allowed them to flourish in some of the most extreme terrains on Earth. But these are just the well-known names. In what is now the United States, the Mississippian culture thrived in the central regions. Their largest city, Cahokia, located near modern-day St. Louis, had a population greater than London in its time. The central mound there, known as Monk's Mound, is larger in volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. They built ceremonial centers, practiced astronomy, and engaged in continent-wide trade networks. Yet, these achievements are barely mentioned in the global conversation about pre-Columbian history. To call what Columbus did a discovery is to erase all of this. It's like walking into someone's home and claiming you built it. But this isn't just about a misuse of words. It's about how historical narratives shape identities, values, and national pride. By placing Columbus at the center of the story, history was rewritten to elevate European expansion while ignoring the complex, flourishing worlds that already existed. The term New World is itself a European invention, based not on actual novelty, but on ignorance. The Americas were only new to the colonizers, not to the people who had lived there for over 15,000 years. These people weren't wandering nomads. They were farmers, astronomers, philosophers, artists, and engineers. Entire continents had been mapped by their knowledge systems. Ceremonial cities aligned perfectly with the solstices. Crops like corn, potatoes, and tomatoes, staples of the modern global diet, were domesticated by them long before European contact. This misconception is not just about geography. It's about power. It was used to justify colonization, enslavement, and genocide. If the land was seen as unclaimed, then conquest could be framed as a noble mission of civilization rather than a violent seizure. Columbus's arrival triggered a wave of European imperialism that devastated indigenous populations. In just a few decades after 1492, millions would die not only from war, but from diseases like smallpox and influenza brought by Europeans, to which native populations had no immunity. In some regions, up to 90% of the population was wiped out. Entire languages vanished. Entire belief systems were destroyed. Entire histories were silenced. And yet, the man who set this chain of events into motion was celebrated for centuries as a hero, an explorer, a visionary. Statues were raised in his honor. Parades marched through cities. His name was etched into streets, schools, and even a country, Colombia. But what did he actually discover? A new route to Asia? No. He died believing he had found the eastern edge of India. A new continent? He had no idea it existed. Even after 4 voyages, Columbus never understood where he had been. So what is it that we're really celebrating? The idea that Columbus discovered America is not just wrong, it's dangerous. It supports a version of history where indigenous lives, stories, and accomplishments are made invisible. It teaches generations to see European arrival as the beginning of time for the Americas. But time didn't start in 1492. It stretches far, far back, written in stone ruins, oral traditions, cave art, and ancestral memory. Correcting this myth is not about erasing Columbus. It's about restoring balance to history. It's about recognizing that the story of the Americas didn't begin with sails on a horizon. It began with sacred fires, drum beats, starlit rituals, and thousands of years of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. It's about honoring those who were here first and giving them back their place in the timeline of human civilization. History is not just a list of dates and names. It's the story we choose to tell about ourselves. And when that story begins with erasure, it must be retold with truth. Nearly 500 years before Columbus ever set sail from Spain, another explorer had already crossed a vast and terrifying Atlantic Ocean. His name was Leif Erikson. Born in Iceland, raised in Greenland, and the son of the legendary Norse explorer Eric the Red, Leif belonged to a seafaring people who feared no edge of the world. With wooden longships powered by wind and muscle, and with nothing but the stars, the sun, and their own instinct to guide them, the Vikings ventured west into the unknown. But unlike the tales of conquest that would follow centuries later, their journey was one of survival, curiosity, and quiet discovery. Sometime around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson set out on a voyage that would lead him to a mysterious new land. The sagas, ancient Norse oral histories passed down for generations, tell us that Leif and his crew landed in a place he called Vinland. It was so named because of the wild grapes they found growing there, a fertile land, green and rich with resources. But this wasn't a myth. In 1960, a team of archaeologists discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at a site called Lance Aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. Carbon dating confirmed that this was no modern forgery. The structures, tools, and remnants of ironworking matched the exact timeline described in the Viking sagas, placing Norse settlers in North America more than 4 centuries before Columbus. This find shook the historical community. For decades, the idea that Europeans had reached America before Columbus was dismissed as legend, speculation, or even fantasy. But the evidence was undeniable. The settlement was temporary, perhaps seasonal, but it was real. And it raised a profound question. Why did the world forget Leif Erikson? The Norse were not mere warriors in horned helmets, as Hollywood often portrays. They were skilled navigators, brilliant shipbuilders, and relentless in their exploration. They had already established colonies in Greenland and Iceland long before Columbus was born. Their longships could cross open oceans, narrow and light enough to travel rivers, yet strong enough to survive the punishing waves of the North Atlantic. It wasn't luck that brought them to Vinland. It was experience. Unlike Columbus, who believed he was sailing to Asia and never realized he had found a new continent, the Vikings knew they had entered unknown land, but their presence didn't last. Harsh winters, clashes with native populations, and isolation from their homeland made long-term settlement difficult. The Norse eventually abandoned their American outpost, yet the memory of Vinland remained, embedded in sagas and stories for generations. While Europe sank into the Dark Ages, the Norse had touched the edge of a continent that would one day be called the New World. So, why wasn't Leif Erikson elevated as the discoverer of America? Why was his voyage dismissed while Columbus's was glorified? The answer lies not in history, but in politics, power, and narrative control. Columbus's journey was backed by royalty, recorded by scribes, and promoted by empires. It came at a time when Europe was ready to conquer, expand, and claim ownership. Leif's voyage, on the other hand, was quiet. It didn't lead to colonization or wealth. It didn't reshape the global economy overnight. It was an act of exploration for its own sake. And so, over time, it faded into legend. But the truth remains. Leif Erikson was the first known European to set foot on North American soil. His journey was not a myth, but a historical fact supported by archaeology and ancient literature. His ship crossed a cold, unforgiving ocean long before Columbus dreamed of doing the same. And while his name may not be carved into as many monuments, his legacy stands as a reminder that history is not always written by the first. It is often written by the loudest. Even more fascinating is the question of what might have happened if the Viking colonies had survived. Would the Americas have seen a Norse influence centuries earlier? Would the history of colonization, with its violent slavery and forced conversions, have taken a different shape? We may never know. But what we can say with certainty is that the story of discovery must be expanded. It must include Leif Erikson. It must acknowledge the people who reached these shores before the Spanish crowns ever raised their banners. The world remembers Columbus because his voyage was documented, weaponized, and exploited by colonial powers. But if we are to be honest with history, we must also remember Leif, a man who crossed the ocean with courage, found a land untouched by Europe, and left without claiming it as his own. He didn't rename the land. He didn't enslave its people. He didn't declare himself its ruler. He came. He saw. He survived. Modern America is beginning to awaken to this forgotten legacy. In some states, Leif Erikson Day is observed on October 9th, just days before Columbus Day. But for many, the name still rings unfamiliar. The statues aren't as many. The parades aren't as grand. The textbooks still focus on 1492. And yet, the evidence remains. A Norse camp in Newfoundland, iron nails from a Viking forge, sagas passed down for 1,000 years, and a story that challenges the official timeline. Leif Erikson's voyage reminds us that discovery is not a single moment. It is a layered process of arrival, encounter, and exchange. It doesn't belong to one man, one nation, or one era. It belongs to all who dare to cross the unknown, not to conquer, but to understand. And that, perhaps, is the truest form of exploration. Before the echo of European boots ever reached American shores, a vast and vibrant world was already alive, stretching from the frozen north to the tropical jungles, from the deserts to the high mountain peaks. Civilizations rose, flourished, and defined their own destinies. These societies were not primitive, scattered, or undeveloped. They were structured, intelligent, and incredibly advanced in ways that continue to challenge our assumptions even today. When Columbus arrived, he did not discover a new world. He arrived in an already ancient one, in what is now modern-day Mexico. Towering pyramids touched the sky long before any European cathedrals. The Maya, whose civilization thrived for more than 2 millennia, had mastered mathematics and astronomy with astonishing precision. Their calendar system could predict eclipses, map the movement of Venus, and align entire cities with celestial events. They developed a written language, one of only a few independently invented writing systems in human history, inscribed on stone monuments, bark books, and painted ceramics. These were not the signs of simple people. They were the markings of intellectual giants. Their cities were marvels of architecture and planning. Temples rose from jungle floors like sacred stairways to the heavens. Ball courts echoed with games that had spiritual meaning, where victory could bring honor and defeat might bring sacrifice. In places like Tikal, Palenque, and Chichen Itza, the ruins today still whisper greatness, of an empire that measured time in backtons and saw the universe as a cycle of divine mathematics. To the north, another empire thrived. The Mexica, or Aztecs as we call them, created one of the most sophisticated cities the world had ever seen, Tenochtitlan. Built on a lake, it was a floating city connected by canals and bridges, with clean streets, aqueducts, public markets, and towering pyramids. European invaders were stunned by its cleanliness, organization, and size. Bernal Diaz, a Spanish soldier under Hernán Cortés, wrote that it rivaled anything he had seen in Europe. Its central marketplace, Tlatelolco, was so vast and busy that it could host tens of thousands of people in a single day, a hum of commerce, color, and culture. The Aztecs had codified laws, tax systems, educational institutions, and a complex social structure that governed everything from birth to death. Their temples were not merely places of sacrifice, but centers of science, philosophy, and statecraft. Their priests studied the stars, their engineers extended land from water, and their rulers commanded loyalty through divine right and military strength. But even these empires only scratched the surface of the civilizations of the Americas. In South America, the Inca Empire rose high above the clouds, stretching across what is now Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and parts of Chile and Argentina. They built roads that crossed mountains, suspension bridges made of woven grass that stretched over deep ravines, and cities like Machu Picchu that blended architecture with the natural world in a harmony few cultures ever achieved. The Inca had no written alphabet, but they devised a data recording system known as a quipu, a series of knotted cords that captured information through a complex code of twists, colors, and links. Their agricultural techniques turned steep Andean mountainsides into massive terraces capable of feeding millions. Their temples were lined with gold and dedicated to the sun, their most sacred deity. Yet, despite their lack of wheels or draft animals, they managed a logistical empire the size of Western Europe, and they did it all from above 10,000 feet. Further north, in what is now the United States, great cities rose along the Mississippi River. The Mississippian culture, centered around the city of Cahokia, flourished around 1000 AD. With a population of over 20,000, it was one of the largest urban centers in the world at the time. Its central structure, Monk's Mound, stood over 10 stories high, a colossal platform of earth built by hand, layer by layer. Around it stretched plazas, ceremonial spaces, wood henges for solar tracking, and neighborhoods organized with intent and purpose. Trade routes connected Cahokia to the Great Lakes, the Gulf Coast, and the plains. Goods, ideas, and cultures flowed through a network of relationships that spanned thousands of miles. And yet, most people have never even heard of Cahokia, as if a city larger than medieval London could simply vanish from memory. Throughout the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved entire villages into cliffsides. Places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon were masterpieces of environmental adaptation. These people understood solar alignments, water management in arid climates, and sustainable architecture centuries before Europeans even began their experiments in windmills and aqueducts. Their homes, constructed in tight harmony with the stone and sun, served not only as shelter but as spiritual centers, reflections of their cosmic beliefs. Across both continents, the indigenous peoples of the Americas domesticated crops that would go on to feed the world. Corn, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, cacao, these are not just foods. They are the products of scientific mastery, developed through selective breeding over generations. These agricultural revolutions sustained large populations, allowed for urban planning, and transformed global diets. When Columbus arrived, he didn't bring civilization to the Americas. He took its fruits back to Europe. What's more, these civilizations did not exist in isolation. They interacted, fought, traded, and influenced each other. There were shared mythologies, regional styles of art and architecture, and a deep spiritual reverence for the land that connected them all. In many cases, the land itself was seen as alive. Mountains as ancestors, rivers as gods, and the earth as a living, breathing force that demanded balance and respect. To ignore all of this, to reduce it to footnotes in history, is to commit a second erasure. The first erasure came with conquest. The second came with the stories we chose to tell afterward. For centuries, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were depicted as primitive, lost, or uncivilized. But nothing could be further from the truth. They built civilizations with depth, beauty, and resilience, and many of them did it in perfect harmony with nature, something the modern world has yet to achieve. This land was not empty. It was not waiting to be found. It was not discovered. It was lived in, loved, worshipped, and understood by people whose roots went deeper than European memory could imagine. When Columbus stepped onto those islands in 1492, he did not begin a new chapter. He interrupted an old one. History is often told as a straight line, simple, clean, and easy to digest. But real history is tangled, full of what-ifs, maybes, and half-erased stories waiting to be rediscovered. When we say Columbus discovered America, we rarely pause to ask, was he really the first outsider to arrive? The evidence suggests he was not. And perhaps more interestingly, he may not have even been the second or the third. Centuries before Columbus was born, the mighty Chinese Ming dynasty sent 4 fleets of such scale and power that even modern naval historians marvel at them. Under the command of Admiral Zhang He, these treasure fleets, some ships over 400 feet long, traveled the seas of the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as East Africa, Arabia, and possibly beyond. Zhang He was not an explorer in the European sense. He wasn't seeking land to conquer or people to convert. He was showing China's wealth, prestige, and presence. But some believe he may have gone even further across the Pacific toward the Americas. There are maps, ancient ones, that some claim show parts of South America with surprising accuracy long before Columbus sailed west. The most controversial of these is the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, which includes coastlines that some believe could only have been known through earlier, secret voyages. Chinese records, including texts written centuries later, suggest Zhang He's ships may have crossed into the unknown waters of the East. While mainstream historians don't all agree, one fact remains. The Chinese had the technology, the experience, and the scale to reach the Americas long before Europe was ready to dream beyond the horizon. But they may not have been alone. Travel across the Atlantic might sound impossible without modern ships, but the ancient world was more connected than we think. Around 1311, a Malian king named Abubakar II reportedly abdicated his throne to explore what lay beyond the Western Sea. According to detailed accounts by Musa Musa, his successor and the richest man in recorded history, Abubakar launched a fleet of 200 ships across the Atlantic, determined to find the edge of the world. Only one ship returned. The rest vanished, sailing into legend. Some historians dismiss the story as myth, but others point to ocean currents that flow naturally from West Africa to the coast of South America. Ancient African sailing technologies were advanced, and it's entirely plausible that some of those ships made landfall. There are oral traditions in parts of South America and the Caribbean that speak of black-skinned visitors who came by sea long before the Spanish arrived. There are even architectural and cultural hints that resemble West African influence. While definitive archaeological proof is still debated, the story of Abubakar opens up a stunning possibility that Africans may have reached the New World not as enslaved people, but as explorers. Meanwhile, thousands of miles across the Pacific, another ancient group of master navigators ruled the ocean, the Polynesians. With double-hulled canoes and celestial navigation techniques unmatched in their time, the Polynesians settled islands thousands of kilometers apart, from Hawaii to Easter Island, and possibly even to the shores of South America. Evidence supporting this comes not only from their sailing prowess, but from the existence of the sweet potato, a crop native to South America that appeared in Polynesia centuries before European contact. How did a South American plant find its way across thousands of miles of ocean to remote Pacific islands? The answer points to one of two things. Either South Americans sailed west or Polynesians sailed east. Either way, it implies cross-ocean contact between two civilizations long before Columbus was ever born. More recently, genetic studies have shown that Polynesians and some native South American groups share markers of ancient contact, a scientific fingerprint of ancient meetings lost to time. These stories are not only fascinating, they're important, because they reveal a very different world than the one we've been taught. A world where exploration didn't begin with Europe. A world where Africa, Asia, and the Pacific were not just waiting to be discovered, they were discovering, too. Columbus didn't sail into a void. He sailed into a world already filled with movement, memory, and momentum. There are those who argue that unless there's hard, irrefutable evidence, carved stones, metal tools, buried ships, we should be cautious. And yes, skepticism is part of responsible history. But so is curiosity. So is humility. And when oral traditions, ocean currents, botanical evidence, genetic data, and ancient maps all start pointing in the same direction, perhaps the real question isn't whether it's true, but why it's been so quickly dismissed. The dominant narrative of history has always favored those who wrote it, and those with the power to spread it. European colonizers not only conquered lands, they conquered memory. They erased the stories that didn't fit their narrative. The idea that they were the first, the bravest, the boldest. It wasn't just a belief. It was policy. It was justification for empire. But the truth is far more global, far more complex, and far more human. Exploration did not belong to one race, one flag, or one crown. The oceans were never empty highways waiting for a hero. They were crossroads, dangerous, alive, and full of people already moving, already thinking, already reaching beyond their known worlds. Perhaps Zheng, he really did cross the Pacific. Perhaps Abubakari's ships did reach the Americas. Perhaps Polynesians touched the coasts of Chile. Even if only one of these stories is true, it reshapes everything. It turns discovery into dialogue. It changes the story from who arrived first to how many arrived and how long ago. In the end, maybe we'll never have all the answers. Maybe some mysteries will remain just beyond our grasp. But what we do know is this. History is far bigger than we were taught. And if we want to understand the world, not just as it was written, but as it truly was, then we must look beyond the sails of Columbus and into the winds that carried other explorers long before him. Christopher Columbus did not become a hero by accident. He did not rise to legendary status simply because of what he did in 1492. His elevation was the result of centuries of storytelling, myth-making, and historical revision, crafted carefully by those who needed a symbol. The man who was once forgotten, even controversial in his own time, was later sculpted into a beacon of courage, adventure, and European triumph. But why? And more importantly, who decided that his story should be the one that defined discovery of America? The truth is, after his death in 1506, Columbus's reputation was not exactly heroic. He had been arrested, disgraced, and stripped of his titles by the very monarchy that funded him. His governance in the New World was so brutal that Spanish settlers themselves reported his cruelty. Columbus ruled with violence, greed, and arrogance. He enslaved native peoples, imposed impossible tribute systems, and unleashed a wave of destruction that would echo for generations. Even his contemporaries described his rule as tyrannical. His own crew turned against him. For years, his name faded from significance. He was not celebrated as a national icon. He was seen as a failure of colonial administration. But then, centuries later, something changed. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a young United States was struggling to define itself. The new nation, born from revolution and in search of cultural identity, needed heroic figures who could symbolize discovery, ambition, and European roots without directly tying back to British colonialism. Columbus, though Italian by birth and Spanish by sponsorship, became a perfect candidate. He was distant enough from modern political struggles, yet bold enough to represent exploration. And most importantly, his name wasn't yet deeply associated with the horrors of colonization. Poets began to romanticize him. Painters depicted him as a noble visionary staring westward across an endless ocean. Textbooks rewrote his journeys as moments of pure genius. Statues were erected in his honor, first in the United States, then around the world. By the time the 400th anniversary of his voyage arrived in 1892, Columbus had become a near mythical figure. Cities were named after him. His image was printed on coins, stamps, and school walls. He had been transformed, not by fact, but by design. A key force in this transformation was the Italian-American community. Facing discrimination and seeking cultural acceptance in America, many Italian immigrants embraced Columbus as a symbol of pride. After all, he was an Italian who had achieved global recognition. By aligning themselves with his legacy, they fought for social integration and national respect. It worked. In 1937, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Columbus Day became a federal U.S. holiday. For Italian Americans, it was a moment of triumph. But for indigenous communities, it marked the institutionalization of a lie. Because behind the parades and patriotic speeches was a truth that refused to stay buried. Columbus's arrival had triggered one of the most catastrophic population collapses in human history. His actions led directly to the enslavement of thousands, the introduction of deadly diseases, and the dismantling of entire cultures. His voyages were not peaceful explorations. They were the opening shots of conquest. Columbus wrote in his own journals of how easily the native people could be controlled, how they could be forced into labor, how they could be used to find gold. He took captives, broke families, and initiated the transatlantic slave trade long before it became institutionalized. He wasn't a man who discovered a new world. He was a man who introduced it to a new kind of suffering. And yet, for generations, none of this was taught. The darker truths were omitted from school books. The atrocities were whitewashed. Children were told about 3 ships, a brave sailor, and a noble dream, but they were not told about the chains, the blood, the burning villages. This wasn't just a case of historical ignorance. It was deliberate narrative control. Columbus was useful, and so the truth about him was buried under centuries of myth. But today, that myth is crumbling. Around the world, people are re-examining the stories they've been told. Statues of Columbus are being removed. Schools are renaming Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Scholars are digging deeper, uncovering the voices that were silenced, the cultures that were erased, and the legacies that were overshadowed. Yet, the shift is not just about Columbus the man. It's about what he represents. He has become the face of a larger historical system, colonialism, Eurocentrism, and erasure of indigenous truth. To challenge his legacy is not to rewrite history, but to correct it, to widen the lens, to make space for the millions of people whose lives and contributions were hidden behind the banner of discovery. It's also about understanding how myths are built, how heroes are manufactured, how public memory is not always shaped by facts, but by needs, political, cultural, and national. Columbus was turned into a hero because the narrative needed one. But the world is no longer satisfied with fairy tales. It demands complexity. It demands honesty. Columbus is not a simple villain, just as he was never a simple hero. He was a man of his time, driven by ambition, blinded by power, and consumed by the promise of wealth. His voyages changed the world, but not always for the better. And recognizing that doesn't erase history. It enhances it. It allows us to grow from it. As the myth fades and the truth emerges, a new question takes its place. Not should we celebrate Columbus, but whose stories have we ignored for too long? Because beyond the Columbus narrative lies an ocean of silenced voices. Navigators, scholars, traders, farmers, warriors, priests, mothers, and children who lived, thrived, and endured long before that fateful year of 1492. They were not lost. They were never missing. They were simply unheard. Now it's time we listen. So no, Columbus didn't discover America. He arrived at a land already full of life, knowledge, and history. Others came before him, and many paid the price after. History isn't just about dates. It's about who gets to tell the story. And now it's time we tell the truth. Backhand index pointing right if this opened your eyes. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this story. Bell subscribe to History Vault for more hidden truths from the past.